You may think that once you've achieved success, love, recognition, and influence, a sense of lasting happiness would naturally follow. After all, isn't that what we're told to chase our whole lives? But imagine reaching the very summit of human accomplishment, world-renowned as a genius, loved by millions, wealthy beyond worry, with a family who adored you, and then suddenly finding yourself unable to answer one simple question. Why am I even alive? That was the crisis that shattered Leo Tolstoy at the age of 50. Leo Tolstoy wasn't just any writer. He was, and still is, one of the greatest literary minds to walk this earth. War and Peace and Anna Karenina, his towering novels, weren't just bestsellers. They were cultural earthquakes. Kings, scholars, and revolutionaries alike revered him. His estate was grand, his family beautiful, his reputation unmatched. He had everything that most people would spend their entire lives yearning for. And yet, behind closed doors, his soul was disintegrating. At 50, Tolstoy faced a psychological implosion so severe that sleep became his only relief. Not because he was tired, but because it was the only time his mind would go quiet. The same mind that once produced epic masterpieces now tortured him with questions that refused to be answered. Why live when death is inevitable? What is the point of creating, of loving, of striving, when all of it ends in the grave? If not now, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then in 30 years. Does it make any difference? He wasn't mourning a lost love or facing financial ruin. He was mourning the collapse of meaning itself. This wasn't a man who lost his way. It was a man who had walked every path and discovered that none of them led anywhere. And the most disturbing part? No one around him knew. He smiled. He worked. He played with his children. But inside, he was standing at the edge of a psychological abyss. If you've ever looked at your life and felt a silent ache that you couldn't explain, or questioned why success doesn't feel like satisfaction, you're not alone. Tolstoy felt it too, loud, relentless, and paralyzing. This wasn't just a passing midlife crisis. It was what philosophers now call an existential crisis, a spiritual earthquake that demolishes all previous frameworks of meaning. Tolstoy's entire worldview, his goals, his pleasures, even his art, suddenly felt like a well-polished lie. From the outside, his life sparkled. But on the inside, he was sinking into despair. "Something is wrong with me," he wrote. "My soul is sick." And this wasn't just poetic language. Tolstoy was genuinely suicidal. In his essay A Confession, he revealed that he had to constantly hide ropes and sharp objects to prevent himself from acting on his impulses. The only reason he didn't follow through? He couldn't bear to leave his family with the trauma. So instead, he did what many thinkers before him had done in times of despair. He started asking the dangerous questions. What is the meaning of life? Why was I born? What happens when I die? Is there a truth that can make existence bearable? And most hauntingly, is there a reason not to take my life? For Tolstoy, these weren't intellectual exercises. These were life-or-death inquiries, and they began pulling apart everything he once believed in. When the walls of certainty collapse, most people reach for a lifeline, anything that can explain why they should keep going. For Tolstoy, that lifeline was knowledge. If life had no apparent meaning, then maybe reason could give him one. So he turned to the world's greatest thinkers. He devoured philosophy. He studied science. He dissected religion. He hoped that somewhere, buried in pages of wisdom, he would find something, anything, that could silence the chaos in his mind. But what he found was even more terrifying than silence. Let's go back to his roots. Tolstoy had always been skeptical of institutional religion. He had lost both parents at a young age, and the church's promises of love and salvation had felt hollow in the face of that pain. In his early writings, he described religious doctrine as something blindly accepted, propped up by tradition and fear, not truth. Religious doctrine, accepted on trust and supported by external pressure, he wrote, gradually falls apart under the weight of real life. But now, in the heart of his crisis, he was willing to re-examine everything. He reread the Bible. He studied Buddhism. He turned to the teachings of Socrates, Solomon, Schopenhauer, even Darwin. And here's what shook him. The more he read, the more hopeless he became. Philosophy gave him beautifully worded despair. Science gave him cold facts, but no comfort. Religion gave him rituals, but not answers. He found himself standing at the crossroads of human knowledge, and every path seemed to lead to the same destination, nothingness. From the philosophers, he heard, "Happy is he who was never born. Death is better than life. To live is to suffer." From science, he heard a different kind of despair. Darwinism told him that humans were nothing but chance organisms in a vast, uncaring universe, valuable only when healthy, and destined to rot once our cells began to decay. Biology had stripped away the soul and replaced it with a system of chemicals and instincts. Science could explain how the body worked, but it couldn't tell him why he should stay alive. That was the paradox. The more he understood the mechanics of existence, the less he understood his place in it. He felt like a machine with a broken purpose. I could give names to the stars, he later wrote, but I couldn't explain why I shouldn't hang myself. He had all the knowledge in the world, but no reason to wake up in the morning. This inner devastation was so profound that he began to fear himself. In a confession, he described how sleep became his only escape, a place where the tormenting voice of why could finally fall quiet. But when he woke, it returned louder than ever. At this stage, Tolstoy saw 4 kinds of people around him, and none of them seemed to have the answer either. The first group simply ignored the problem. They distracted themselves. They worked, played, talked, and lived without asking questions. Tolstoy envied their ignorance, but he couldn't unknow what he knew. He couldn't go back to pretending. The second group turned to pleasure. They drowned themselves in indulgence, wealth, romance, food, status. This was the path of the Epicurean, but Tolstoy saw through it. Pleasure was temporary. Suffering always returned. You could eat all the honey, but the beast and the dragon were still waiting. The third group were those who gave up entirely. They saw no way out and considered suicide to be the only escape. And though Tolstoy admitted he'd stood on that same edge, something inside him still whispered, "Keep searching." And then there was the fourth group, the most tragic. These were people who knew life was meaningless, but couldn't bring themselves to end it. So they simply existed. Not living, not dying, just drifting, waiting, numb. That's where Tolstoy saw himself, suspended between despair and the hope of something he hadn't found yet. It was a spiritual limbo, a kind of quiet, suffocating paralysis. This is what made Tolstoy's journey so painfully human. He wasn't trying to be profound. He was trying not to fall apart. And in that desperation, a strange thing began to happen. He stopped looking upward, toward ideas and abstractions, and began looking outward, at people. Not philosophers, not scientists, but peasants, servants, the poor. And that changed everything. When the mind can no longer carry the weight of life's unanswered questions, the heart often takes over. And that's exactly what happened to Tolstoy. After exhausting every avenue of reason, after tearing through volumes of philosophy and science and still finding nothing but emptiness, he stopped looking for answers in books. Instead, he began to observe people. But not the elite, not the intellectuals. He looked at the poor, the peasants, the simple folk who worked the land, buried their children, endured hunger, and still managed to smile. This wasn't some romantic idealization of poverty. What struck Tolstoy was the quiet resilience of these people. How they suffered and still believed. How they had nothing, but still carried a sense of peace he had never known. He was shocked. Because while his wealth and education had given him every material advantage, they had robbed him of something these peasants had in abundance: faith. They believed in God, not because they had proof, not because they had time to debate theology, but because that faith held them together. To Tolstoy, it was a revelation, not a mystical experience, not a divine light, but a human one. He began to realize maybe life wasn't meant to be solved like a math problem. Maybe the meaning of life wasn't hidden in logic, but in love, struggle, and surrender. The peasants had no time to indulge in existential despair. They were too busy surviving, too busy helping each other, too busy living. And it dawned on him, their peace wasn't rooted in answers. It was rooted in something bigger than the questions. Faith is the force of life, Tolstoy wrote. If a man lives, he must believe in something. For the first time in decades, he felt something stirring in his soul, not certainty, but a soft willingness to believe again. And that belief didn't start with dogma. It started with humility. He began to understand that his despair wasn't just philosophical, it was spiritual arrogance. He had believed he could outthink life. He thought intellect could fill the void. But the void was not of knowledge, it was of connection. And so, slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild his life on a different foundation. Not one of indulgence, not one of theory, but of simplicity, of surrender, of faith in the infinite. What does that mean? It means living with the understanding that you are not the center of the universe. That there is something larger, more enduring, more mysterious than your individual mind can comprehend. And that's not a weakness. That's where meaning begins. For Tolstoy, the shift wasn't sudden. It wasn't even entirely comfortable. His rational mind still questioned everything. But now, he saw that faith didn't require the absence of doubt, it required the courage to live despite it. This is what set him free. Not a new answer, but a new orientation. He no longer asked, "What's the meaning of life?" He began to ask, "How can I live in alignment with what matters most?" And from there, everything changed. He simplified his life. He gave away much of his wealth. He began serving others. He devoted himself to humility, peace, and compassion. He no longer needed to dominate the world with his intellect. He just needed to show up for it with love. The man who once feared the abyss now found beauty in the struggle. The man who nearly ended his life now lived to uplift the lives of others. And in this quiet turning, we find the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the search for meaning doesn't end with an answer. It ends with faith, not in religion, not in ideology, but in the very act of living with care, curiosity, and humility. When a man rebuilds his life on faith, everything changes. Not just what he believes, but how he lives, how he loves, how he dies. For Tolstoy, the realization that faith, not logic, was the bridge to meaning didn't just lift him out of despair. It called him to action. He couldn't go back to his old life. He couldn't keep pretending that status, money, and prestige still mattered. So he began letting go. He donated much of his fortune. He gave up the luxuries of aristocracy. He started dressing simply, eating modestly, walking among the poor, listening, serving. But this transformation didn't come without cost. His family, especially his wife, did not understand. She had built her life around the Tolstoy who was famous, brilliant, wealthy, not the Tolstoy who now spoke of surrender, sacrifice, and spiritual discipline. Their relationship strained. She feared he had lost himself. But in truth, he had finally found himself. This tension between inner transformation and external rejection is something many people experience when they awaken to a deeper truth. You outgrow the world that once fit you so well. And sometimes, the people who love you the most are the ones who struggle to accept your change. Tolstoy lived with this contradiction. He carried the weight of disappointing those he loved, even as he tried to live in alignment with what he now believed. True life is lived when tiny changes occur, he once said. And these tiny changes reshaped everything. He began writing spiritual essays, advocating for peace, nonviolence, and a return to simple living. He inspired future thinkers like Gandhi. And though his version of faith wasn't traditional Christianity, it was deeply rooted in love, humility, and the idea that the divine could only be found through the infinite in all things. He no longer needed life to make sense. He just needed it to be meaningful. He stopped chasing certainty and started practicing presence. He gave up the illusion of control and embraced the quiet dignity of service. He was no longer trying to escape death. He was trying to honor life. And eventually, that life, so full of contradiction, conflict, and courage, came to an end. On November 20th, 1910, at the age of 82, Leo Tolstoy passed away. Not in a mansion, not surrounded by fanfare, but in a small railway station, having quietly walked away from everything to live out his final days in solitude. He died as he lived, not as a perfect man, but as a searching one, a man who dared to look into the abyss and found not an answer, but a new beginning. And maybe that's what meaning really is, not something you figure out, but something you live into, one humble act at a time. Maybe meaning is not something granted to us, but something we grant to the world. When we choose love over fear, service over self, and presence over performance, Tolstoy's story reminds us. Even at the peak of life, you can feel lost. Even at your lowest, you can find light. And sometimes, what saves us is not knowing everything, but believing in something. Even the greatest minds, like Tolstoy, have stood in the dark, asking, "Why am I here?" Maybe you've been there too. And maybe the answer isn't in having everything, but in letting go, not in knowing the meaning, but in choosing to live with purpose anyway. So let me ask you, what gives your life meaning when nothing makes sense? Share your answer in the comments. You never know who it might help. If this video resonated, like it, share it, and subscribe so we can keep exploring life's deepest questions together. You're not alone in the search. And maybe that's the beginning of meaning.